Developing online tutorials, the content. So when we deal with content being the materials that we distribute as well as the actual, I hate to reuse the word the content of the content. So we're talking about the targets or the standards that are being addressed when we present online tutorials. So the content can be thought of as the videos, the pictures, the slideshows, the voice only if you're doing a voice or a document, websites that are interactive. But I think more importantly than that, we need to ask what is actually being presented. This is the basic content. It's very easy to stop with some basic content. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, especially when we're dealing with challenging situations or situations that have been or have come upon us suddenly. But that doesn't mean we can stop or ought to stop at just this basic content. But let's talk about some basic content first that we can see that has to do with practice. So there's some online practice content that a lot of teachers turn to. I know that I have. One of them is Khan Academy. Khan Academy is great because it's free. There are a lot of things that you can assign. It incorporates with Google Classroom. There's more than just math topics that are there. There's multiple subjects with videos that you can share and share with those students. And sometimes, especially in other topic areas, those other videos can be super helpful. But I will say that you can also install, or not install, but embed those videos into your own content as well. Other practice content would be IXL or Alex. Both of these definitely strong in the math departments, but there are other contents there as well. And then we have just a multitude of other online things that you can find, whether it be websites or whatever you have that you can share online with your students. But there's other content that you can share with them that is physical practice content. I think when I think of the physical practice content, first I think about printable worksheets. So even if you're sharing it digitally, they're printing them off or at least looking at them on their computer screen and writing on a piece of paper. And so sometimes we can resort to this option. Images of problems or questions can also be hugely helpful. We can go that route. There are other documents for viewing. You can share Word documents, slideshows, all sorts of things. And finally, Google Forms or any other type of quiz or format, form format that you can find where you're asking questions and you're getting responses from students. This one can be super helpful as far as practicing skills that you've given to them. And so whether you've given them videos or shared with them videos, things that are already online, you can create some basic Google Forms that can then be shared with your students through Google Classroom or other methods where you can then ask them some questions and get some responses based on those things. Even if it's a printable worksheet, students can print those out or write the answers on a separate sheet of paper, take a picture of it, send it back to you. But these are some practice areas and I think some basic content that we can deal with, we ought to deal with, but I think that we can go bigger than that. Sometimes, though, just seeing a problem is not always enough. Sometimes a student needs to see a little bit more than that. On the left, we have a basic equation. This is a multi-step equation, variables on both sides. And I may have taught a student how to do this. I may have given them all kinds of step-by-step instructions, but sometimes seeing that isn't enough. But as soon as they see this question and then they hear your voice go, okay guys, in this equation I need to get the x, right? The terms that have the x, I want to get them on the same side. I'm going to start with subtracting 2x from both sides. Now let's actually do this, guys. 2x minus 2x is 0. This 8, right, nothing's happening to it. 3x's minus 2x's is just 1x. minus 5. We're almost done. Now we have our x on this side, but there are no longer any terms on the other side with an x. So now I'm going to add 5 to both sides, because that's going to eliminate this 5. 8 plus 5, that's right, 13, x. So guys, notice we started with this x, and by using these basic principles that you've learned in class and you've seen illustrated in other places, we now have the x all by itself, and the number on the other side represents what the x equals. X is 13, and this would be your answer. So notice when I'm doing a problem like this, when I add the content of me speaking, it comes alive for that student. Suddenly it goes from being this stagnant problem to something that their teacher is sitting there and working on with them. Sometimes all it takes is 1 or 2 of these questions, and the nice thing is your students can pause you, rewind you, rewatch you if they're not listening to you and they think, oh man, I didn't hear you. You don't have to repeat it. They just go back and rewatch it. Let me do another one here. Let's say you told a student that this is a right triangle, and let's say you said they need to identify the hypotenuse of this right triangle. And so just saying those things, having it typed out in instructions, may not be enough. But if you record a video along with it and you say, okay guys, here we have a right triangle. Now I know this is a right triangle because this angle right here is a right angle. Now it's not in there yet, guys, but you know what? If we ever see a box in the corner of a triangle, this means that this is a 90-degree angle. That's what that little box means, 90-degree angle. And so here we have a 90-degree angle in the corner. So that makes this a right triangle because a 90-degree angle is a right angle. Once I find this, I now know which of these 3 sides, there's 3 sides, I know which of these 3 sides is called the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the side that is opposite the right angle. Now, you may already know exactly what that is. Do you know what that is? If you said side AC, you're correct. But let me show you a little trick that I do sometimes. I'm going to switch to a red pen for just a moment. Notice this right angle kind of looks like the end of an arrow. So one of the things that I do when I'm trying to find the hypotenuse is I look at that right angle and I think about it as an arrow pointing to the hypotenuse. So the right angle points to the hypotenuse. So that's a nice easy way to remember if you get stuck. So this side is the hypotenuse. Now if I gave you a question, or if you were taking a test that said which side is the hypotenuse, and they didn't just want you to point to it and say, hey, it's right there, I found it. A way to answer that question is to say the name of this side. This side, we're going to use the 2 points on the ends of that side, point A and point C. So I'm going to call this side AC. And in geometry, to identify it as a segment or a side, we're going to put this symbol over the top to show we're just talking about that segment. So if you see this, this would be side AC. Now, is there any other ways that I could have named this that would have been correct? If you said yes, you are correct. It doesn't matter the order of these letters because side AC would be the same thing as side CA. So another way that I could have said this was CA. AC and CA are both referring to this side that is called the hypotenuse when it is in a right triangle. Okay, so notice again that with all of these things, I'm able to add, you might consider extra thoughts, extra ideas. There's things that I might miss if I was just trying to type things out, things that they probably wouldn't read. But if you create a short video, you can share a lot more information. This particular video I've created entirely in PowerPoint. I'm just looking at my PowerPoint screen and I can show you how to create these, but this is a simple one. It only has to be one slide. Now, I could be wrong, but in my opinion, most of my students over the 19 years I've been teaching Many times what they really want, they just want you, just please, they'll say it, just show me. And so many of our students just need to see it happening right in front of them. And I found that many of our kids, if it takes just one explanation, sometimes that's all they need. And I know that I'm the exact same way. So this might be an extra reason to include and start thinking about how you can develop short online tutorials. We need to continue to think about this as we think about the future. One of the options that could happen this next year could be that we have no time with students. I highly doubt that will happen, but that's what happened this year. We had no time with our students, face-to-face contact. So developing short tutorials is a great way to have and include some extra time with those students. Even if they cannot log in the same time you do to have an online meeting, creating a very short video tutorial is a great way to say, here this is, check this out, this is how you do this. We might end up with limited time with students. If we have limited time with students, this is still a great way. The time that we then have with our students in the school building, face-to-face contact, right there in the building, we can at that point, instead of spending all of our time explaining, we might be able to, if we've been able to send them with the tutorials, the teaching has then happened at home, hopefully. But the time that we have then in the classroom would then be question answer time. We get to be more of a guide answering those questions. They've watched the short video, they've got a basic idea, but then they've had time to develop the actual questions that they really need answered because they've seen the basics. Even if we end up back with our students full time, creating short tutorials is a great way that I've found in my classroom to engage with the students. I had several times where I had a class that had a difficult time focusing on what we were doing, and I still had though several students in my class that really wanted to know. And so I got into the habit with this one particular class of having them each and every day get on their Chromebooks, pull up that day's tutorial. They could watch it and get to work. A lot of my students that didn't want to watch the tutorial, but then they said, hey, how do you do this particular problem? I'd say, all right, now it's time to hop on here and you can rewatch this. And I actually had many of my kids who normally wouldn't listen to me teaching, would listen to me teaching that way. So it's a great option no matter what the future ends up looking like. This developing these short video tutorials is a great way to begin engaging our kids regardless of what the situation ends up being. I would like to suggest that when you're doing a tutorial, an online tutorial, that you do the tutorial in two parts. Whether it ends up being just one video or not, 2 parts I think is the way to go, and this is just my recommendation. You can take it or leave it. This is my recommendation for what I found works with most of my students. Have the lesson in 2 parts. The first part would then be what you could call the lesson. So the lesson would be the part where I'm explaining concepts, giving those basic ideas of exactly what it is that they need to know and they're going to need to do when they get to the practice. So the first part will be the lesson. In that, I'm going to give some basic ideas, simple thoughts, like I might give the definition of a hypotenuse, or I might give the definition of an equation or a term of an equation. I might give the definition of a variable. You can give definitions in this and define things and go through those basic steps so that when you get to the next part of the lesson and you start practicing it, it'll work. You can, in the lesson, give a few examples, but I would keep the examples very basic in the lesson portion. Just give the basic setup, here they are. Sometimes at the very end I might give one challenging example just so that they know what they might expect. But this first part of your tutorial, I recommend you ought to do the lesson. The second part of your tutorial, I recommend, ought to be the part where you practice together. What I mean by this is that you focus on those examples. So the things that you would actually need your students to be able to do or to demonstrate, you're going to show some examples of those. So what I did in that previous portion of this video where I showed the right triangle and I showed the hypotenuse and I showed here's an equation that you're solving, that would be a great example of the practicing together. I recommend that in addition to solving the problems, which I'm obviously focusing on math, you're working those out, but you're talking to the students. So talk to them while you work out. I mean, let's be honest, you know the typical mistakes that many students make when they're actually trying different problems. So talk to them and speak with them and say, here's this, here's that, here's an option, look out for this. Now, oh, here's a common mistake. But we're going to talk to the student like they're actually there. Make sure that they know exactly what they need to do when they're working these problems out. I think you'll find with just a couple of good examples that can set some students going. This second portion, many times you can do follow-ups. Quite often, if I had the same question show up again and again, I would then be able to create a video just for those specific questions. I might say on number 38, there's a lot of questions I get from students. Let's try that one together. And just a real short, just that one question video. So these are the two parts that I'm going to focus on, and I think that we all ought to focus on when making these short video tutorials. A lesson and then some practicing together. Now, before I get into an example, because that's exactly what I'm going to do next, an example where I'm going to create I'm going to create two video tutorials from scratch just to demonstrate what the whole process looks like. But I want to give you two suggestions when you're making these video tutorials. The first one actually comes from my father-in-law. My father-in-law used to always say this. Now, for those of you that know me, one of my other jobs that I have is a pastor at a church. And when he comes to hear me preach, he always gives me this reminder. He says, just remember, kiss. Okay? Now, for my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, these mean different things. For my mother-in-law, KISS stands for keep it short and sweet. Okay, so my mother-in-law, she says that means keep it short and sweet, and she emphasizes the short. But to the point, right? To the point. Now my father-in-law, when he says kiss, he tells me it means this: keep it simple, stupid. Okay, now I'm telling you right now, there's a lot of wisdom actually in both of these. A little harsh, but there's some wisdom in these. You get to the point. Don't ramble on. Make sure you go right to exactly what your students need to hear, need to see. Talk about those things. Make it real for them, but get to the point. Keep it simple. Don't overwhelm them in your videos. The second suggestion is keep students in mind. One thing that I recommend doing is visualizing them right there, like you're explaining it to them. They're looking at your paper, they're looking at your screen while you're talking to them, and you're talk to them in that tone of voice that's reassuring them, hey, we can do this. Let's work through this problem together. Okay, guys, let's try this one. Keep it upbeat, but keep them in mind. And in my opinion, let's visualize those kids that we love while we're creating those videos. I think if you do this, you'll find so much of that will filter through in the way that you talk. Things that you don't even realize that you do, you'll find that you're doing and encouraging them in ways that you didn't even know that you could. just by being real about how you feel about them. If you feel frustrated and disgruntled that you have to be creating a video, it's going to come through. Don't do it. Stop and think about where those kids are at. Drive around your town. Look at what those kids are doing, how they're living, what's going on in their lives. Any contacts that you make with parents, do those things. But when you come to make these videos, remember, this is a chance. I know for a lot of our students, the school is the safest place that they go. And so they miss that. Believe it or not, they miss that. And so you can bring a small sampling of that back to their homes when you create short videos and they get to hear your voice. But I'll tell you right now, kids can detect fake a mile away. So when you're doing this, mean it. Care about them and think about them while you're explaining these concepts. All right, so we've talked about our tech basics. We've talked about our content. Now we're ready to do some examples. So when I jump into the examples that I'm going to do, what I've decided to use, I'm going to use PowerPoint. I'm going to use PowerPoint for my recording and delivery. I'm going to deliver it through this Google site. Now for your sake, I'm actually going to also show you how to incorporate it into a Google form. That way you'll be able to see both. So we're going to deliver it this way, record it this way, all those options. But then the content itself, obviously I'm going to use some math examples. I'm going to try to use some basic math examples, but really this can work with so many other areas, so many other options. I would love to see some of those put into practice, but for today's examples, this is what we're going to do. I would encourage you to, as soon as we're done with this, to try this on your own. Try some of these things out. But let's get into these examples where I show you how to use these tools with this content, and hopefully you'll learn some things along the way, more than just the technology, but also learning about how you can present a tutorial to your students that will be meaningful to them and helpful. When you're ready to go to the next portion, go ahead and click next at the bottom of the screen as soon as this video is over.